Well, thank you for joining us once again. Welcome to Grace. We've covered quite a distance in our journey through the Bible, having finally arrived at the four gospel accounts a week or so ago. And we began exploring those in those earlier studies. But the one thing that's been glaringly apparent throughout the entire series to me is the lesson that God wanted the children of Israel to learn about the meaning of his compound Jehovah name. That's where it's been all along. Learning not to put any trust in their own capacity, their own abilities. Flesh doesn't have it. And to put all their trust in the name of the compound name of Jehovah. To call upon his name and then to learn to trust upon in his name and in his name solely. That's the area. That's the main facet of everything we've been studying all the way through the Old Testament, all the way up till today. The error in judgment made by Lucifer when he expressed his intent to be just like the Most High God, proving that he failed to recognize God's unlimited capacity, began to trust in his own capacity, is the failure that God does not want Israel to make, because Israel will ultimately be God's earthly replacement agent for Lucifer. Everything that was true of Lucifer in time past, as far as being on the holy mountain of God and walking up and down amongst the stones of fire, and every precious stone being his covering and being light, will be true of Israel in time future, as Israel takes the place, in a sense, of Lucifer. And we know that Lucifer had been in the garden. That's where it all began, not in the garden, but in Eden, the territory called Eden. And the Bible calls that God's house. So God has a plan to repossess the earthly realm. And he's going to use the nation Israel in that plan. So in order to fulfill the role that God has in mind for Israel to play in his plan to repossess the earth, they'll have to learn to place no confidence in themselves. They'll have to learn not to make the error in judgment that Lucifer made, and to learn who God is, and then call upon and trust in God to be everything that his compound name implies. So the object of Lucifer's faith had been himself. Israel would have to learn to place their faith solely in the faithful capacity of the Most High God, as we've been saying. So there, to refresh our minds, let's go back. Let's take a look at those names once again as they appear in Scripture. These are not listed in any particular order here, but consider for a moment that what each of them meant to the nation Israel as God was teaching them to call upon and trust in who he is, the compound name of the Most High God. Israel would need for God to become some things on their behalf. Some things they would have no capacity on their own to become. For instance, the nation would need for God to exercise the Jehovah Yireh aspect of his name, which means the Lord our provider. And they'd have to trust him to do that graciously because they'd have no capacity to provide for themselves or to merit his provision for them. So they just have to simply look to him and call upon his name. Nowhere did that become more obvious, more evident, than in their rescue from Egyptian captivity, to be followed by their wilderness journeys. Apart from the exercise of the Jehovah Yireh component of God's name, the Lord our provider, the Israelites would have never been able to come out of Egyptian captivity in the first place, nor would they have been able to cross the Red Sea when they reached that point, or find sustenance when they became hungry and thirsty. But what did God do? He became their Jehovah Yireh, their provider, and he did so graciously. They certainly didn't deserve his doing so, as we've seen over and over again. He simply exercised the Jehovah Yireh aspect of his name on his nation's behalf in a grand display of his glorious provision in light of their great need of Jehovah. He would ultimately become their provider by becoming their redeemer down the road, and we know that as well. The Most High God also became Israel's Jehovah Nissi, another one of the compound names you see on the list there. Their banner, the Lord our banner. We expressed it as their conquering hero when it came to the defeat of their enemies. That aspect of the compound Jehovah name, Jehovah Nissi, became apparent in the wilderness. When Israel encountered the Amalekites, the Israelites had to not only do battle with all the elements they faced, they had to do battle with those who were coming against them, and doing so on a continual basis. What did God do? He became Israel's Jehovah Nissi, her banner. The banner, just as a quick reminder here, the banner referred to the battle standard in Israel's day. You could think of it like a flag. Each unit in an army would follow behind its proper banner. Through their battle with the Amalekites, God was teaching Israel that they should follow him and that he alone was the banner that they should look to and place their trust in. And he exercised his Jehovah Nissi name, the Lord our banner name, when it came to their enemies. And he did so over and over again. Notice a statement from the psalmist, as he had obviously come to appreciate the Jehovah Nissi component of God's compound Jehovah name. Speaking for Israel, the psalmist wrote these words in Psalm chapter 20, verse 5. We will rejoice in thy salvation, thy deliverance, the deliverance God alone could provide, and in the name of our God. So here we have that name component popping up over and over again ever since the garden. It was the name of God that he's teaching Israel. We will set up our banners. In the name of our God, we will set up our banners. The Lord fulfill all thy petitions. 2 verses later, the psalmist said, some trust in chariots and some in horses. But we will remember, here it is again, the name of the Lord our God. So chariots and horses were used in battle, so you can see that this is a battle context here. This is a Jehovah Nissi or Jehovah our banner context. The Lord exercised the Jehovah Nissi aspect of his name, and he did so over and over again. He became their conquering hero, their battle banner while in the wilderness and while they were in the land. Seems that wherever their journeys took them, there were those who were standing at the ready to try to defeat God's nation. So Israel would stand in desperate need for the Lord to exercise the Jehovah Nissi component of his name and do so on his nation's behalf. And that need would arise time and time again. Throughout their wilderness journeys, God was teaching his nation the necessity of calling upon and trusting in his name and in his name alone. The fact that it was the Lord who had led Israel through their wilderness journeys, through their stay in Canaan, was a demonstration to the nation of the Jehovah Ra'ah component of God's compound Jehovah name. Jehovah Ra'ah meaning the Lord our shepherd. Now we've heard that. Now we know where that is in the Bible, in the Psalms, but the Lord was their shepherd, and that's why we see that in the Psalms. He was their shepherd. The Lord had been their shepherd, the one who led them all along the way. Do you remember how the Lord accomplished being Jehovah Ra'ah, their shepherd, their leader? Well, look back with me at Exodus chapter 13, verses 21 and 22. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. They could travel whether it was day or night. He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor did he take away the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So they knew he was there. They knew he was their Jehovah Shammah. He was with them. Another one of the compound names of Jehovah. Through that pillar of cloud and that pillar of fire, the Lord became Israel's Jehovah Ra'ah, her leader, her guide, her shepherd. And as evidenced by this depiction that I'm giving you of those two pillars, the Most High God went beyond the exercise of his name on behalf of his nation. He allowed the children of Israel to see his name as he put his name into operation. The children of Israel would have been able to legitimately say, they could have pointed to those pillars and said, that is a God thing. Why? Because God allowed them to see his name in operation over and over again. They were the sign nation. So God dealt with them according to signs. He gave them things they could see that they would know his name was being exercised on their behalf. The law contract was, we could say the nation was God's law contract nation. Equally so, the law contract nation was God's sign nation. Through the prophet Isaiah, God revealed to his people that a child would be born to that nation, and that this special child would become their earthly king. I'm sure you recall Isaiah's words in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. Listen again to this all-familiar prophecy. I know you folks have heard it. We're going to hear it again right here. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. For unto us a child is born, written long before that child was born. Unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, all beginning with capital letters because these represent the compound Jehovah names. Wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. So this king was going to reign. This child was going to become their king and reign forever and execute judgment and justice in the earth. Who was going to perform this? Israel? No, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So God was going to bring it about. At least 100 prophetic statements, there are books out there, I think 2 or 3 of them, 100 prophecies of the Old Testament fulfilled through the birth and life and ministry of Jesus Christ on the earth. Over 100 prophetic statements about Israel's promised coming king. And those statements were made centuries before the king came upon the scene. Statements that were fulfilled, again, with Christ's birth and ministry to the nation Israel. We need to understand that while we're in these 4 gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're reading about Christ's birth and his life and ministry to the nation Israel. We're not reading about him establishing something brand new with us, with the church today. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are called New Testament. They're still not New Testament books. They're pre-New Testament books because Christ had to die before the New Testament would be initiated with Israel, and they'd get a taste of that. But we're in these gospel accounts, so we're looking back at how the prophets foretold about the life of Christ. Israel had only to look back at their Old Testament scrolls and what they had to say about their coming king, and then compare what they saw in their scrolls to what God gave them to see through the birth and life of Jesus Christ in order to connect the dots and be able to identify who had come, the child that had been born, as their Messiah, their true Messiah. But Israel failed to see the signs that God was placing right before their very eyes. For instance, the prophet Micah said in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be the ruler in Israel." This is the child that was to be born, "whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting." This is the one who always was, who is and will always be. The child to be king would come out of Bethlehem, said long before the child was ever born. Micah prophesied that 700 years plus earlier, which is precisely where the Christ child was born. He was born in Bethlehem. The books of Matthew and Luke name the town of Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus Christ. So when we get to the Gospels, we see the fulfillment of prophecy concerning the coming child, the coming king. The fact that Israel's coming king would come from or be born in Bethlehem when compared with the birthplace of Jesus Christ was itself a sign given to the nation, but that would only be one of a multitude of signs that God would provide for the sign nation Israel. We could go back much earlier than Micah. Notice this statement in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, made as early as 1,400 years prior to the birth of Jesus Christ. Jacob was blessing his 12 sons in this passage, and his blessing to Judah was particularly telling. Notice what Jacob prophesied concerning Judah, his son Judah. Genesis 49:10 once again. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh." That's an epithet for Messiah. "Till he come, and unto him, the Messiah, shall the gathering of the people be." So Jesus was born some 2,000 years after Jacob died. And his ancestry is traced back to Jacob's son Judah, just as Genesis 49 had proclaimed through Jacob, and both in Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke. That's why we see those ancestries there, to show prophecy being fulfilled. They could look at their scrolls, they could look at Christ, and they should have been able to connect the dots and say, this is truly our Messiah. The prophetic statements about Israel's coming Messiah go on and on. Listen to what the prophet Isaiah said in regard to what would be taking place when the one that was to come, the Son of Man and the Son of God, the God-man, when he arrived on the earth, we see Isaiah saying what would be taking place. These prophetic words are found in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 4 through 6. "Say to them that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, even God with a recompense. He will come and deliver you. He will come and save you. This isn't talking about saving from their sins. This is talking about delivering them. When you come across that word save or salvation in your Bible, make sure you know the context. It's not always from deliverance from sins. They could be delivered from a number of things, and they could be delivered from their enemies. The statement that Israel's God would come with a vengeance speaks to the fact that the Lord would be their Jehovah Nissi. Here's the name again. Their banner, and the one who would avenge Israel's cause with her enemies. The Lord would do that. And he would purge unbelievers out of the nation. That's what will take place in time yet future. At Christ's first appearance, the nation was given the opportunity to believe that he was the promised king to whom the prophets had been referring all along. In John's gospel, we see the attitude of the majority of the people of Israel when their prophesied king was on the scene. Here it is in John chapter 19, verse 15. But they cried out. Now they should have connected the dots. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. They never acknowledged the signs. They never connected the dots. Now notice what Isaiah said would be occurring at the king's arrival in verses 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, Isaiah 35, 5 and 6. And the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. Did Jesus Christ not come performing miracles of healing, just as Isaiah had prophesied would be taking place? Sure he did. Isaiah mentioned the deaf, the dumb, the blind, and the lame. Christ healed the blind man in Mark chapter 8. Watch what Mark revealed in his gospel account, chapter 7, verses 33 through 37, in regard to the man who was both deaf and had a problem with his speech. Mark 7, 33 and 34. And he, Jesus Christ, took him, the man who was deaf and couldn't speak properly, aside from the multitude. And Christ put his fingers into his ears, and he spit and touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and saith unto him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Now, we see this taking place, so-called miracles taking place when fingers are put into ears with some of our modern TV evangelical faith healers. But you never see them spit and touch the person's tongue, and then a person who couldn't speak can speak for the first time. And his ears were opened. Was the man healed, as Isaiah prophesied would be occurring when Israel's king was on the scene? Watch verses 35 through 37. And straightway his ears were opened, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. He didn't say baby and not get it right. He spoke plain, and he charged them they should tell no man. But the more he charged them, so the more a great deal they published it, and were beyond measure astonished, saying, he hath done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. It's interesting to me when you read something like this, how the flesh remains the flesh. No matter the dispensation that we're in. The more Christ charged them to tell no man, the more they did what? The more they went out and did the precise opposite. They spread the gossip. Gossip that travels at the greatest rate of speed is gossip that always begins with the words, I'll tell you something if you promise not to tell somebody else. But don't understand, Christ didn't tell them not to reveal his identity for the purpose of having the people disobey him. Some might come to that conclusion. It was through the giving of that charge that Christ proved that perfect obedience was not a capacity the people of the law contract nation had within them. And in spite of the miraculous signs he was giving to that nation, the testimony of those who had viewed those signs firsthand, the nation for the most part held firm to their rejection of their Messiah who had come to heal them. So Christ came in fulfillment of the proclamations made by Israel's prophets and in direct connection with God's plan to repossess the earthly realm through a king and a kingdom vested in a nation, and that nation is the nation Israel. The four gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell the story of Christ's ministry while on the earth to God's earthly nation. As Christ was born under law and Jewish, he was a Jew born under law, teaching Jews under law. And Christ fulfilled the promises their prophets had proclaimed concerning Israel and her promised king. As we've been saying over and over, they should have been able to connect the dots. The 4 gospel accounts also reveal how, in spite of the numerous signs given by Jesus Christ, signs proving that he was indeed their prophesied Messiah, Israel never recognized him for who he was. They didn't want to believe that he was their Messiah. He didn't look like the Messiah they expected. He didn't look like the Messiah that they wanted to see, and they rejected him. In our previous lesson, we began looking at the visual evidence that Israel was given through the ministry of Christ on the earth to Israel. The mighty God, Christ, we began watching him exercise in his name in a miraculous manner, exercise the Jehovah name in a miraculous manner. So he was proving to Israel through these miracles he was performing that he was the I am of their Old Testament scriptures. He was the fulfiller of the compound Jehovah names on Israel's behalf. He was the great I am. Now think back for a moment longer to Christ's words as recorded in Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 17 and 18, where Christ said, "And these signs shall follow them that believe." Number 1, in my name they shall cast out devils. Well, that's a great one right there. Talk about God becoming Israel's banner, her Jehovah Nissi. Satan was the most formidable opponent God's nation could ever face. The demons doing Satan's bidding through their tactic of indwelling at that time were fighting against God by working in opposition to God's people. So the people of God's nation were in desperate need of God's provision and his deliverance from their demonic possession. What did God do? Well, through the God-man, Jesus Christ, he became Israel's provider, their Jehovah Jireh, as well as their Jehovah Nissi, their banner, their conquering hero. Also their healer at the same time. Not only did Christ cast out those demons, those who believed that Christ was the promised Messiah and were willing to make their law failure confession by way of John's baptism with water, were empowered to do as Christ had done. Christ would manifest God's compound Jehovah name in more than one way. In the Mark passage, Christ went on to say, "They shall speak with new tongues." Now we began to look at these things. What a provision for the nation the restoral of a common language would become. Restoring a common tongue or language was necessary for the Jews who had been living in those outlying areas and who were speaking only the language of the area in which they lived. For those Jews to understand the Holy Spirit's ministry through the apostles at Israel's high holy feast day of Pentecost, where Israel was given a taste of their promised coming kingdom and the restoral of a language, they could all hear in their own language what was being spoken. One sign of that promised earthly kingdom was that God would restore that common tongue, that common language, so that all people could serve him with one consent, the Bible says. When it came to their common language, the Lord became Israel's provider. He provided that language, their Jehovah Jireh. So you can see over and over, it's all about the compound name of God and teaching Israel that lesson. They shall take up serpents, a third thing. If they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them, Christ went on to say. Here we see the provision of health and well-being for the believers of the nation. Anyone that wants to hear about health, wealth, and prosperity should go back to Jesus Christ on earth and what Israel, the law contract nation, the sign nation, was promised, because they were given those signs. But notice the fifth sign revealed by Jesus Christ to show the nation Israel that their promised earthly kingdom was lying right at their doorstep. The king was among them. Sign number 5 was that they shall lay hands on the sick. They might, should, could. What's it say? They shall recover. Quite different from what we see in our day. Christ came healing the sick. Christ came giving Israel a most vivid demonstration of the Jehovah Rapha aspect of God's compound Jehovah name. The Lord is our healer, Israel could say. When foretelling the nature of Israel's promised earthly kingdom, Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 33, verse 24, another very familiar verse to most of us here, "And the inhabitant of that earthly kingdom shall not say, I am sick. The people that shall dwell therein shall be forgiven their iniquity." Not only would he be their redeemer, he'd be their healer, their Jehovah Rapha. So it's all about his name. God hadn't given Israel just one sign of the nearness of their promised earthly kingdom through the ministry of the one who had come to manifest God's compound name, Jesus Christ. He gave them numerous signs, signs after sign after sign. For the Jews require a what? sign. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22, and God gave them a sign. The Jews require a sign. God gave them signs. Israel's not only the law contract nation, as we've been saying, they were also God's sign nation. God has had no other sign nation. There is no other sign nation but the nation Israel. So the evidence of that's a God thing, Israel could legitimately say. It's being said today, and God's being accused of things he's not doing. He's being credited with things he has nothing to do with. So, we need to understand what's happening and why. Physical healing was a sign, not only of the presence of Israel's promised king, but of the nearness of Israel's promised earthly kingdom. The gospel accounts are jam-packed with the fulfillments of prophecy that came through the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ to the sign nation, Israel. It was just as the prophet Isaiah had foretold in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4, where Isaiah said, surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. What a sign of the Messiah Israel had been given when Isaiah's words began to ring true during Christ's earthly ministry to Israel, as relayed in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. When the even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils. So here we have it all over again. And he cast out the spirits with his word, and he healed how many? He healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, himself took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses. So when we look at the four gospel accounts, since we're doing our journey through the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, link those four gospel accounts to the prophets of Israel. Because what those four gospels are doing is telling us from four different perspectives how Christ became the fulfiller of the prophecies speaking of the great I Am and God's compound Jehovah name. We could go on and on matching the writings of the prophets to the fulfillment of their prophecies through Jesus Christ, but Israel's Messiah. But just be very careful as we go through these four gospel accounts, not to read yourself into to God's law contract program and the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ to the sign nation. A lot of people look back at Christ's earthly ministry and they say, that's what we're to do. That's what we're to follow. You've seen the bumper sticker. What would Jesus do? WWJD. Now, well, Jesus would do everything the law required him to do because he was a Jew under law teaching Jews under law. But be careful not to associate yourself with God's law contract program. To be associated with the signs of the sign nation is the same as to be associated with the law contract program. Many are anxious to claim Israel's signs today. They're looking for those signs, but they'd better rethink what it would mean to have God deal with them according to the law contract. The program underway, the program under which God had been operating with the nation while his signs to that nation were being manifested. So while the signs were being exercised, the law was in place. So people who want to go back and claim those signs had better rethink their desire to go back and live under the law. Unfortunately, some think they are and that they're doing it successfully, but not the case. Now, a little later in our Bible journey, when we move from the four gospel accounts into the book of Acts, we'll be looking more closely at the gift of tongues and at the gift of healing. What was taking place there? Why was Paul doing some of these things? We're going to be looking at that. And we're going to be looking at those gifts as those gifts related to the nation Israel and her promised earthly kingdom. But for now, I want to look at some other signs that Christ relayed to the people, the nation, in the four gospel accounts, because it's not only the signs that he performed in connection with the kingdom and the empowerments to get through their tribulation and enter their kingdom, he gave his disciples some other signs. He talked about some signs. And he did so in the book of Mark. And he began to display these signs to show the nation this is what will be taking place. What else could Israel expect to see with their eyes in regard to the approach of their promised earthly kingdom? Now, they saw him perform the signs of that kingdom. The answer to that question is the nation could expect to see certain signs regarding the final 7 years sitting in Israel's fifth and final bucket of wrath. The bucket which must be empty before the return of Israel's king and the setting up of Israel's earthly kingdom. The king came the first time, and the people to whom he had come, the people of Israel, didn't want him. They rejected him as their king, and they cried out for his crucifixion. As you recall from one of our previous lessons, prior to the initiation of that final 7-year time period, sitting in Israel's fifth and final bucket of wrath, God postponed the fulfillment of his program. He postponed the pouring out of the last 7 years that Gabriel prophesied to Daniel. And he ushered in a program of Gentile grace, as we call it, through the calling out of a new apostle, the apostle of the Gentiles, the Apostle Paul. In answer to the plea of Peter, the vine dresser of the fig tree nation in Christ's parable, the fig tree, God gave Israel that 1-year time extension that we read about in Luke's Gospel, chapter 13. He gave them 1 additional year to prove whether or not they were capable of producing the righteousness they had sworn they were capable of producing under the law contract. The righteousness they assumed they could produce by way of their performance. Or, on the other hand, to confess their inability to earn their righteousness by way of their performance, agreeing that all Israel had failed in their attempt, which was what God wanted the nation to do. When that 1-year extension was up, you see that on the diagram there, at the stoning of Stephen, God placed his program with the nation Israel on the shelf, in a manner of speaking. The pouring out of that final time of judgment, sitting in their fifth and final bucket of wrath, the final 7 years being reserved for a future time, as God ushered in an unspecified time period we now know as the dispensation of the grace of God. It would be a dispensation of Gentile grace during which God would recognize no national distinctions whatsoever. The present dispensation is not about God's law contract nation, nor is it about the signs Christ was giving that nation, nor is it about John's baptism with water in connection with Israel's law failure confession. This program of Gentile grace is about what God is doing in light of Israel's national refusal to make their law failure confession. Confession the nation will indeed one day make. We need to understand that God did not bring the unbelieving Gentiles up to the level of the nation Israel had previously enjoyed as being the children with whom God was dealing. He cast the unbelieving Israel down to the level of the Gentiles he had previously cast aside due to their reprobate thinking, so that God could have mercy on all during this grace dispensation. The program of God that's in place today is not about God's plan or purpose to repossess the earthly realm through a special nation that would become a peculiar treasure unto him, a nation above every other nation on the earth, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, due to their rise, according to prophecy. But it's about the fulfillment of God's plan to repossess the heavenly realm in light of Israel's fall, and according to what the Bible calls the mystery or the secret that God had been keeping regarding the special dispensation of Gentile grace. The people of God's earthly program knew nothing at all about this previously unrevealed program of Gentile grace. They had no idea it was coming. They only knew, according to Gabriel, 7 more years was sitting in their future before their king appeared on the scene. They knew only that the final 7-year time segment of Gabriel's prophecy had to play out before Christ would return to set up his promised earthly kingdom, and they attained that special status that God always had in mind for his special nation. Christ performed the signs of the kingdom while he was on the earth. These signs were empowerments for Israel's upcoming period of tribulation, and signs pointing to the character of their upcoming kingdom. But how did Israel respond to the signs that God gave them once again? Those signs being displayed by the God-man, they rejected the one displaying them, and they cried out for his crucifixion. After Christ was crucified, rose again, he continued to preach to Israel for 40 more days, after which he ascended into heaven. So in order to carry out his earthly kingship, Christ would need to return, would he not? He left. He ascended into heaven. But he would need to return to Israel to carry out what he said would be carried out. Since he had performed the signs demonstrating that he was indeed their promised Messiah, proving his identity as the I am of their Old Testament scriptures, while he was with them, would God give them signs, the sign nation, would he give the sign nation signs pertaining to their king's impending return to them? Yes, he would. The answer is yes. God filled Israel's program with signs. God's program with Israel is God's sign program. What signs would God give to the sign nation about their king's return to them after his ascension into heaven? The signs that Christ said the nation could expect to see in regard to their king's soon return are sitting in Matthew chapter 24. It's not about us. It's not about a rapture of a church today. This is about what Israel could expect to see. Christ would return to the earth at the conclusion of the final pouring out of the contents of Bucket of Wrath number 5. When we return to Gabriel's prophecy of the 70 weeks of years remaining in Israel's final bucket of wrath before the return of their king to set up the earthly kingdom, we see that when Israel's 1-year extension had come to completion, only that final 7 years remained before the return of their Messiah. It's in Matthew chapter 24, verses 3 through 9, that Christ revealed what the nation could expect to see as the final portion of the 7-year period known as the tribulation moved toward its completion. Now, before we look at the specific signs Christ mentions, let's look back at what Israel's prophets had to say about this 7-year time period called Jacob's trouble in the Bible. It's the final 3.5 years of this 7-year tribulation period to which these prophecies relate, and more particularly the return of Jesus Christ that would come at the conclusion of the 3.5 years, known as the day of the Lord. There are many verses to which we could point, but we'll focus on just a few to show you what I'm talking about here. You'll recognize these prophecies from our previous studies. They relate to the day of the Lord and Christ's return to the earth. The prophet Amos, speaking of this troubling time, said these words in Amos chapter 5, verse 18, "Woe unto you." We'll do a word study on that word woe sometime. "Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light." Jeremiah, speaking of the same troubling time, said in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7, "Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be delivered out of that trouble." Daniel, pointing to this time of sorrow, said this in Daniel chapter 12 in the final portion of verse 1, "There shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time the people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." Let's not forget the prophecy of Zephaniah. We've got to put that in here, because Zephaniah also spoke of the return of Israel's king. In chapter 1 of his book, verses 14, the prophet said, "The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. The mighty man shall cry there bitterly." These are going to be Christ's opponents in that day. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Can you imagine the return of Jesus Christ and what it will be like when the King comes back on the earth with vengeance? If you've been listening to the words trouble, distress, wasteness, desolation, darkness, gloominess, a time of bitter crying, you can see that the theme resident in all those words is sorrow. It's sorrow. The return of Jesus Christ to the earth will be a time of sorrow to all the unbelievers of the earth. It'll be a time of Christ's purging and avenging wrath, as we read earlier, against all those who will be rejecting him as the rightful monarch of the earth in that day. Now, as we move forward from the prophets to the time of Christ's ministry on the earth to Israel, Christ adds to the words of the prophets in Matthew chapter 24, where he reveals what the nation can expect to see as that day on Israel's horizon begins its approach. Notice the picture he painted for his disciples in Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 3. "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be," what are they always seeking? "A sign. What shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world?" Now, we know that the word world is a translation of the Greek word aeon, meaning age. We're aware of that. But the idea here is that the end of the world, as the world had been operating through all the previous dispensations, and in accordance with the god of this world, Satan, the prince of the power of the air, the one who'd been working with all the might he could muster to usurp God's glory since the time of his rebellion in Eden, and the one who worked feverishly to resist God's use of the nation Israel in his plan to repossess this earthly realm. "Tell us," Christ's disciples asked their Messiah, "what shall be the sign? What shall be the evidence that you're going to show us of your coming and the end of the tribulation period?" Because that's what it's all about. Let's return to Christ's response, beginning with verse 4. "And Jesus answered And he said unto them, Take heed that no man trick you, no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So if they were hearing of wars and rumors of wars, what were they tending to think? He's right here. It's on the horizon. What's being said today when we look around the world and see all these things taking place? Why it's so-called Christendom today saying, we must be at the very end. Well, we might very well be at the very end. Who knows? But we can't look at these things as they are signs, and we'll show that. The Jewish believers would be hearing things that would trouble them, all right, but not only would they be hearing troubling things, they'd also be seeing things that would cause them sorrow of heart. Back to Christ's words in verses 7 and 8. Matthew 24, For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now think about the signs God revealed to his disciples, things that would be taking place, things that could be seen, and things that would point to the return of Jesus Christ to sit in the throne of David as the monarch of the earth. There are five major things sitting in verses 6 and 7. And we'll list them as Christ described them. And Israel was told, don't look at these things and think this is it. He's right here. Don't be deceived. These things are going to be happening. Number one, false Christ would appear on the scene. Wars and rumors of wars would characterize the time leading up to the return of Israel's king, with nation coming against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Number three, famines would be characteristic of this time. 4, pestilences, a translation of the Greek word meaning plagues or diseases, would be a prominent feature of the time leading up to the Messiah's return. And finally, earthquakes would be occurring in divers places. Now, they weren't to look at these things and say, oh, he's here, because these things would be occurring before his return. Now, I needn't tell you, because most of you already know what I'm about to say next. What do the vast majority in religiondom, as I like to refer to it, tell us we're seeing today in our day? The answer, according to many, is we're seeing Matthew 24 be fulfilled. We're seeing the signs of the times. In other words, we're seeing the signs that point to the nearness of the rapture of the church, is what they suppose. Could these people be correct? They point to AIDS. We know HIV and the devastating effect it's had on the world, and to Ebola as being pestilences unknown to man in time past. They point to conflicts occurring in the Middle East over and over again, and around the globe for that matter. And they say, here it is. We're seeing the times Christ was speaking of in Matthew chapter 24. Wars and rumors of wars. We're seeing the evidence that the end of the world is right upon us right now. Every time a major earthquake takes place in the world, more fuel is added to the fire of what we might call the present-day sign seekers. Of course, in a failure to rightly divide the word of truth, they also point to the recognition of the United Nations, the recognition the United Nations gave to the establishment of a state for Israel in 1948. And they put all these things together. Naturally, if you connect the prophetic regathering of the Jews to the land God promised them to the 1948 UN decree, allowing for the establishment of the Jewish state, and then you connect the wars and rumors of wars we see in our day, add in the current pestilences we read about in our newspapers, and of course, then mix in the fact that earthquakes are indeed taking place around the globe, you can see where these religious folks come up with the idea that we are seeing the signs of Israel's times. And that therefore, the end of the world, as Christ spoke of it in Matthew 24, is knocking at our door right now. Not to mention the fact that ministers of righteousness are the ones who are connecting the dots between all these things that are being seen and the end of the world, and they're doing so as we speak. Are we indeed seeing the signs of Israel's times? Or are we living in the times of Israel's signs? Are we seeing the signs of their times because we're living in the times of their signs? Let me give you several reasons why I believe the latter to be true. We are not seeing the signs of Israel's times because we're not living in the times of Israel's signs. Simple as that. So we cannot look at these things as proof that God is showing to us that the end of the age of grace is upon us. First of all, do I believe that we're indeed approaching the time known as the 7-year period of tribulation? The answer to that question is yes, I do. Of course, generations of people have thought the very same thing, and yet here we are, living in a more dangerous time than those folks could have ever imagined. Now, some of you have probably heard of what has been called the Doomsday Clock. Anyone hear about the Doomsday Clock? Sure. It was developed by a group of researchers called the Chicago Atomic Scientists. They participated, by the way, in the Manhattan Project. It's not an actual clock. It was a depiction of a clock to be used for the front of their journal. The clock was used by these scientists to gauge the nearness, in their minds at least, to the technologically induced destruction of the human race they thought would be occurring. The clock made its appearance in 1947 on the cover of the publication called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The Science and Security Board meets twice every year, they still do, to discuss global events and to consider a possible resetting of the clock. They began in 1947 with a clock setting of 7 minutes to midnight. The times fluctuated numerous times ever since, as you can see on the graph I'm presenting you. They reset the clock to 2 minutes to midnight in 1953 when the U.S. and the Soviet Union tested thermonuclear devices within 9 months of each other. The hands of the clock were reset to 12 minutes to midnight, backed off a bit in 1963 with the U.S. and Russia when they signed a partial test ban treaty. As you can see, the hands on the clock have been set back and set forward numerous times in the 20 adjustments that have taken place since 1947. The most recent clock setting took place January 22nd of this year, when they moved the time remaining until doomsday forward from 7 minutes to midnight to 3 minutes to midnight once again. Humanity has supposedly lost 4 minutes. But as you can see, if anything is characteristic of the doomsday clock, what is it? It's that word fluctuation. Up and down, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards. Are we living in a dangerous world? Who would question that fact? We are indeed living in a very dangerous world. But apart from things such as nuclear catastrophe, climate change, as that was part of the criteria used to just move the hands up this in January, the possibility of a massive continent-killing asteroid colliding with the Earth, as we often hear about, is God showing us the signs Christ mentioned in the book of Matthew that we might know that we are sitting in Israel's time period? Well, the answer, of course, is no. Are we seeing the signs that Christ talked about to prove that we are living during Israel's times? That's the way to put it, and the answer is it's no, at least in this teacher's opinion, and I'll give you many reasons why. First of all, God's program of Gentile grace in his program to repossess the earthly realm through a king and a kingdom vested in the nation Israel are two entirely different programs. They're not one and the same. The program of Gentile grace, called the dispensation of the grace of God, is not on a time schedule. No time schedule is given for the dispensation of grace. It's wound on now for around 2,000 years or so. God's program with the nation Israel was indeed on a specific time schedule, as relayed to Daniel by the angel Gabriel. So Israel's times were not left to question. They were revealed and they were precise. Gabriel revealed them very clearly. We know from Gabriel's revelation that 7 years of tribulation and the great sorrow foretold by her prophets remain at the bottom of the fifth and final bucket of wrath that God set on the shelf, in a manner of speaking, when he ushered in the age of grace through a new apostle, the Apostle Paul, to bring Gentiles a message of his grace in light of Israel's fall, not her prophetic rise. We've been given no time schedule for the dispensation of the grace of God. It's gone on now, as I said, for nearly 2,000 years or so, definitely way beyond the limits of Gabriel's revelation concerning the remainder of Israel's times prior to the return of her Messiah. When things look bleak here on the earth, it seems like the pendulum begins to swing and things don't look so bleak anymore. When war is right at our door, they kick the can down the road. And we have another time of relative peace, although instability. Secondly, Christ gave a marker, right in that Matthew discourse, as to when the signs he mentioned would begin to manifest themselves. Look back with me at Matthew chapter 24 once again. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Christ gave what I call the time marker of Israel's signs, right after listing the 5 signs we've just talked about. Wars, rumors of wars, false messiahs or kings appearing on the scene, famines, pestilences, earthquakes in different places. Christ's time marker for these signs sits in Matthew chapter 24, verse 8, where he said this: all these signs that he just gave are, note it carefully, what are they? They are the beginning of sorrows. What time period is known as the time of sorrows for Israel? Well, particularly the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. And these signs that he's mentioning to them are the beginning of their sorrows. So they'll be seeing these things, and I think they'll be seeing these things in the land that pertains to their program. What time period marks Israel's sorrows again? We've already looked, the 7-year tribulation period called the time of Jacob's trouble. So that time segment of Gabriel's prophecy will not commence until this dispensation comes to a close. According to Israel's prophet Joel, when God commences his program with Israel, the next thing heard by the Gentiles will be the declaration Joel talked about in Joel chapter 3, verse 9, where Joel said, proclaim ye this among the Gentiles. Do what? Prepare war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. A declaration by our apostle of grace and peace, such as characterizes this dispensation from God to us, is not a declaration of war and wrath. It's the precise opposite. So we are not seeing the signs of Israel's times because, number 2, we're not living in the times of Israel's signs. Reason number 2, God's showing us that the end of the world signs Christ spoke about it are now upon us. The reason why they are not, as God's sign proof that the end of the world's finally arrived and we're sitting here, is that these signs marking the beginning of Israel's sorrows are only to occur when God's program with the nation Israel is once again the program in operation, and they'll be seeing these things. Then there's a third reason we could give. Reason number 3 that we are not seeing the signs of Israel tribulation times has to do with the gospel message itself that will be being preached when these signs are being seen. Look back at Matthew chapter 24 once again. Notice the message that will be being proclaimed during the final 7-year period, known as the time of Jacob's trouble. Here it is in verse 14. And this gospel of the what? This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations at that time, and then shall the end come. When will that gospel of the kingdom be being preached? During that 7-year tribulation period. Can anyone tell me what the gospel or good news of the kingdom was all about? The gospel of the kingdom was the good news that Israel's promised earthly kingdom was sitting right at her doorstep. What were the Israelites and the Gentile proselytes to Judaism supposed to do in response to that good news that their earthly kingdom was right at their doorstep? They were supposed to do what the 12 apostles and Jesus Christ prompted them to do. As Peter proclaimed in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, then Peter said unto them, repent, change your thinking, Israel, and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, so that you can join the church on the corner. No, for the remission of sins, Israel's national failure under the law contract. And do we have it on there? Peter told them to repent. Ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. And now, we've already talked about the necessity of Israel's national law failure confession, so we needn't go back and rehash that issue here. But suffice it to say for now that the apostle of the Gentiles, the apostle to whom the dispensation of the grace of God was committed to bring to us, never taught the gospel of the kingdom. Because with the stoning of Stephen and the ushering in of Paul, that kingdom was not on Israel's doorstep any longer. So never again will you hear those words, the gospel of the kingdom, after the stoning of Stephen and the conversion of Saul. Paul brings to us the gospel of Christ. The gospel Paul called my gospel, the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery, and why the apostle Paul said he was not sent to baptize. We'll be going through the good news messages of Scripture shortly as a part of our Journey Through the Bible series and showing the differences between the Gospels. But reason number 4 why we are not seeing the sudden onset of Israel's signs in relation to her times is that Israel's promised kingdom was placed on hold. And it's not started back again. The earthly kingdom ceased being on Israel's doorstep nearly 2,000 years ago with the ushering in of the new dispensation of Gentile grace, as we called it. And we'll be seeing that more clearly as we continue our journey through the Bible. But how about those 5 signs once again? How about the 5 signs that Christ mentioned? Those signs themselves are 5 more reasons why we are not seeing the onset of the signs of Israel's final 7-year time period. Christ mentioned wars and rumors of wars. Certainly we are seeing world conflict today. We know that. That goes without question. But are the conflicts occurring between nations in our day a new sign that God is giving to Israel and to us that the end of the world, literally age, meaning the approaching climax of her tribulation period, is at our doorstep? Again, the answer is no. Is world conflict something new to our day? Wars and rumors of wars, with nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, have been with us throughout the course of human history. Certainly empires have come and empires have gone. These probably won't do a whole lot of good, but writing is very small. But the people watching this presentation can see that there are a lot of things, a lot of conflicts that have taken place that relate to the human story. We know that the capability to destroy the entire human race through nuclear conflict has been something of relatively recent history. But Christ said wars and rumors of wars, not the total destruction of the entire population of the planet, which will not take place even with Christ's return. And then he also mentioned after wars and rumors of wars, and there's a lot of wars that we could list and the multitudes that have been killed in those wars. He mentioned something else there. What else did he say? Famines. Famines. That's a sign of the onset of the beginning of sorrows, meaning the onset of the tribulation period. Are we seeing famine today in a way that famine has not existed throughout the course of human history? Here again, famines have occurred throughout the world over the course of time. We can give you many pictures of the famines that have occurred. And you could ask me for a list of these, and I could provide it to you, of all the famines that have occurred and the millions that have died through starvation. The reality of starving people in the world has been brought into our living rooms via modern-day TV programs, large screen in many cases today, so we get a sense of starvation today as something reserved for current times, but that's certainly not the case. While the starkness of starvation is something many had not previously witnessed, the reality of starvation through the world, through famine, has been with us all along. So the famines we see today are not a sign of the onset of Israel's times of sorrows. What about the next sign? Well, here we have another one. Christ mentioned in Matthew 24, a sign called pestilences. The Greek word loimos, literally meaning a plague or a disease. In a figurative sense, loimos could mean a pest, although Christ wasn't speaking figuratively with the other signs he mentioned, so we have no reason to move to a figurative sense with this sign. Are we seeing plagues and diseases today? And is the disease something new to the human race? The first case of HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS, the final stage of that virus, came to light in the U.S. in 1981. And an estimated 21.8 million people have died from this ailment. AIDS is no longer an automatic death sentence, as it was at one time, although people still die from AIDS today. Now, add to that distressing disease the fight against Ebola that we've just witnessed. Made headlines here in recent times, not to mention a host of other distressing ailments, such as the superbugs that are being talked about in medical circles, the bugs that have a built-in resistance to current-day antibiotics. You can see why those looking for the signs of Israel's beginning of her sorrows are saying that God is now showing us those signs. But the fact is, diseases resulting in a multitude of deaths have been the bane of humankind throughout the history of mankind. Malaria remains one of the world's most devastating pandemics, we're told. It continues to infect as many as 500 million people every year. Malaria is resistant to drugs, and a dependable vaccine yet to be developed for malaria. There were over 1 million cases of the disease malaria during the American Civil War alone. But malaria didn't come upon the scene with the Civil War. It's considered to be by many to have been a factor in the decline and eventual fall of the Roman Empire. So we're not seeing anything new with what we're seeing disease-wise today. We're seeing new diseases come upon the scene, and then things being brought to light later on that help with those diseases, but they're nothing new. The Antonine Plague was a pandemic that ravaged the Roman Empire from 160 to 180 AD. We're going way back. It killed a quarter of all the people that infected. Following that plague came the plague of Cyprian, that's said to have killed upwards of 5,000 people a day at the height of that plague. Cholera, said to have killed millions between 1860 and the early 1960s. Then there was also the bubonic plague, Black Death of history, Spanish flu that killed as many as 100 million people. So various strains of flu are not a new sign that we're at the beginning of Israel's sorrows. Not to mention mumps, measles, whooping cough. We could go on and on, couldn't we? Rubella, polio, pestilences. We've always had them and will no doubt continue to have them. But I believe Israel will be seeing them in a brand new light in her land at the beginning of her time of sorrows. When we understand that no time schedule is given for the dispensation of Gentile grace, and that we're not living in the times of Israel's signs, and that Israel's promised earthly kingdom continues to be on hold, and that the gospel message to be proclaimed during the beginning of their sorrows and onward is not the good news that we have of Christ's accomplishment today, but it's the fact that Israel's kingdom lies on her doorstep once again. Add that to the fact that the 5 signs mentioned by Jesus Christ to his disciples are not unfolding for the first time during our time. 5 false Christs have come and gone. 6 wars and rumors of wars are not new, with nation arising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Famines are not new to our day, are they? Pestilences are nothing new. Earthquakes have been occurring since the time of the flood of the day of Noah. We have numerous reasons why we are not seeing the signs of Israel's beginning time of sorrow. The signs that Christ was referring to in Matthew chapter 24 regarding his program with Israel and what will be occurring in the land at the beginning of their time of sorrows. But the greatest reason of all why we are not seeing the signs of Israel's times, as those signs pertain to Gabriel's prophecy, to the final outpouring of Israel's 5th and final bucket of wrath, is given us by the Apostle Paul himself, the apostle of the Gentiles, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, where he states as clearly as he could possibly state it, "For we walk by" what? Faith, and not by what? Sight. We couldn't have a better picture there of what God is doing and how he's doing it today. He's not showing us the signs of the beginning of Israel's times of sorrow. We're not seeing those times because we're not living in the times of Israel's signs. Simple as that. We'll leave it there for our lesson today, and we'll continue our journey through God's marvelous book, the Bible, in our next study, which will be next week. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, because going through these books and giving sort of a synopsis, a Reader's Digest view of what they're all about, helps us to understand what we're reading when we're in those books. And it helps us to rightly divide the word of truth and not put ourselves into Israel's program. God has a program to repossess the earthly realm. He has a program to repossess the heavenly realm, and that's where we come in, and that's where we pick it up in our next study.